All right, everyone, thank you so much for coming today. We're back for the new year, not letting you forget what we're doing the research for. We're returning to our research to operations focused monthly webinars. Today, we're fortunate to have David Vallee, who is the Director of the Service and Partnership Division of the Office of Waterstation, and he'll be speaking on communicating a hydrologic forecast, which I know is of particular interest to me and of many of you. So with that, I'll pass it over to David.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Absolute pleasure to be with you. So I'm going to be upfront and honest with you on this one. This whole concept is, as you can see in the background, very personal to me. That is my hometown of West Warwick, Rhode Island, under siege during the record flooding we experienced back in March of 2010. Quite frankly, it was that remarkable event in my lifetime that kind of set me on this path to where I am now, leading SIPD, as we affectionately call it, and having my handprints all over our flood inundation rollout, from the training to the outreach, the education, the road shows we've been doing, and all the frequent flyer miles I'm earning on Southwest, traveling from Rhode Island down to Alabama, which I do enjoy every trip. But this is really personal to me. In March of 2010, that scene behind you is my hometown of West Warwick. We had a forecast hydrograph at a gauged location that was a couple of miles downstream of where you're seeing this flood. We had very little in the way of probabilistic forecast information at that time. We had a deterministic hydrograph. We had a reservoir that we had lost the gauge data from upstream that was controlling 65% of the volume of water coming downstream. We had never seen a flood like this before. I grew up not far from here. In fact, there's a church in the distance near that white car where I made my confirmation back in 1982. That's important because in 1982, that weekend, we had a record flood at this very location. And I remember as a 16-year-old, that water coming close to the intersection, but not getting up to the church steps. Not getting up to that elevation that you see that car floating in the roadway where those firefighters are rescuing people in real time at the height of the flood. So when my office, at the time I was leading the Northeast River Forecast Center back in March, when this flood hit, I walked into my office on a Monday morning on the 28th of March, and my forecast team said, "You got to sit down." We had been under siege with heavy rain over the prior 4 weeks. We had had a flood 2 weeks prior that got about a half a foot over the flood record that I lived through back in 1982. But they were telling me that our models were about to predict a flood that could exceed that flood record by over 6 feet. How do you describe that? How do you communicate that to a governor? A governor that I had a personal relationship for my years of working on hurricane-related evacuation work and our outreach and education on the hurricane threat in the Northeast. How do you describe for them something you've never seen before? How do you describe an event hydrologically that you knew there would be debris under every bridge? Because the old timers, when this town got built in the 1800s, it was a factory town, mill town. You had old dams that were run of river that weren't really doing anything with respect to providing hydropower a local factory, for example. Some of these dams were decrepit, were really in rough shape. So this whole concept of communicating a hydrologic forecast, as I said, is very, very important to me because I've lived through this. If you're wondering, I'll get to the chase. If you're wondering, how did I communicate with the governor of Rhode Island that Monday morning? I simply said, when we got on the phone call, he welcomed his team and he said, "David, we know if we're hearing your voice on this phone." It wasn't a webinar. It wasn't a Google Meet back in 2010. It was a phone call. He said, "That makes us nervous," which shows you the one-on-one relationship we make with our emergency management partners. And that's true across our agency. It's one of the unique things that we are able to do is create that one-on-one touch with the people we work with every day in the emergency management community or in the media, for example. And I was very honest with him. I said, "Governor, I'm going to be right up front with you. I'm scared." And I paused. And he said, "If you're scared, we're frightened." And then I went on to explain to him as best we could that our models were predicting something we'd never seen. that we were predicting flows that would take it off the known relationship of stage and flow, the rating curve. That we knew we were in for one more onslaught of rain, and we were predicting 5 to 8 inches of it. And I could tell him that if we got closer to that 8 inches, this was going to be catastrophic, and it would make that flood 2 weeks ago look like a walk in the park. We didn't have inundation mapping. I had a deterministic hydrograph showing a crest of 19 feet because we didn't have the guts to go out with 21 feet 48 hours in advance of the event. There was that much uncertainty. We told them we're having issues at the reservoir because we're losing the gauge data every time the winds pick up out of the northeast, because the volume at the reservoir was already 2 feet over flashboard. You get to 3 or 4 feet over flashboards, and those flashboards stop blowing out. And I told him the worst thing that could happen would be we lose those flashboards at the water supply reservoir upstream. And I said we could be looking at cascading dam failures down the Patuxent. And then I told him, Governor, you have the only resource that I know of is the flood insurance rate maps. And I said, do you have those out? And in advance, I briefed emergency management, and they had some of the rate maps out for the Patuxent Basin. And I said, I'd like to try to translate for you what that deterministic hydrograph may look like.
Hey, Montana and Vekshinda. Hey, there's a Zoom link in that thing that you should be using instead. Sorry.
Oh, so this is not the place to, okay.
Nope.
Thank you.
Yep, there's a Zoom link, and it's also in the chat of this meeting too.
Oh, thanks.
Okay,
Thank
see you. I'll see you over there.
All right, so what I told him was we started at the upper part of the basin downstream of the reservoir. And I walked him down his flood insurance rate map. And I said to the governor, you have a 100-year floodplain and you have a 500-year floodplain. I said, as a government servant, I can't tell you what to do. But if I'm in your shoes, I'm going to evacuate to the 500-year and I'm not going to think twice about it. As I said, that's the closest thing we have to delineating what this might look like when we get to Wednesday afternoon. And about 2 hours later, we briefed him late in the morning. About 12:30 in the afternoon, here I am lost in the fog of the floodplain, as we say, the fog of war. I finally get to the break room to grab my sandwich out of the refrigerator, and there's the governor of Rhode Island repeating my words, that this was going to be biblical, that this is going to be a flood no one alive had ever seen before, that we run the risk of cascading dam failures, that we could go several feet higher than what the prior flood was, and that everybody needs to consider getting out. And that was kind of the beginning of my sojourn to just, pound fist on table at meetings to state that, our lives in our river centers and our weather offices, trying to fight these big floods with a single deterministic hydrograph, it's not providing the partners what they desperately need. So, Steve, when you approached me to get to talk about communicating a hydrologic forecast, little did you probably know that this really struck a chord with me. I've been in this business for 36 years, starting out as an intern meteorologist, working my way up, running a hydrologic services program here at the Boston Weather Office, later running the Northeast River Forecast Center. I was a science and training officer in the middle of all that, and now at the Office of Water Prediction. This is a really challenging question. So let us dive in. But I wanted you to have that backdrop of that powerful image behind me, because I say I never want to see photos like that again. If we do this right, and as many of you know, we're at the beginning of our 4-year rollout to get our forecast services that depict this kind of inundation in the hands of our partners. If we do this right, I hope to God that we have cleared everybody out of harm's way. So that when we have floods of this magnitude, we're not having to go in with helicopter, fireboat to pull people out. But Darwinism is a powerful thing. Some people have to stand in it to believe it's actually going to hit them. And we see that with hurricane evacuations if we wish to focus in that arena. So I have a question for all of you, though. What exactly do you mean by a hydrologic forecast? Because in the Weather Service, we have a whole family of stuff that we would consider a forecast or a warning as it relates to hydrology. And depending on what we're looking at, really dictates how we may want to communicate that. Now, our bread and butter for years, has been the deterministic streamflow hydrograph, the one you see up here for Langhorne. A great example of a forecast taking a river in Pennsylvania up in a moderate flood stage. Around that stage has context, and we try to paint that context in the way of an impact statement, describing what we know may get wet within a short distance around that gauge, or as far upstream or downstream as we can relate that particular deterministic forecast to some level of impact. That is a service that's out there publicly. It's a graphic that everybody knows how to get to through AHABs. You can get it on your phone. You can subscribe to the INWS and have your phone go off when a watch or warning is issued. The USGS has their own service where when the gauge reaches a threshold, it'll alert on your phone, sending a text message. And there are plenty of private vendors that do the same thing. So that's one hydrologic forecast that we try to communicate. Are we looking at probabilistic forecast of stream flow, of reservoir elevation, pool elevation? That would be this example here, an example of what we call our short range probabilistic forecast. This is a 10-day forecast driven by numerical weather ensemble prediction of temperature and precipitation. But it is run through the hydrologic models, the same ones that we use to provide that deterministic forecast. So there is some one-to-one correlation. Here, we're capturing some level of probability of exceeding or reaching minor or moderate or major. Through this probabilistic forecast, it gives us increased confidence when we see all of the peaks aligning themselves in the same time frame. We can break this down and actually look at the precipitation. We'll get into some of this as we go along here. So that's an example of a probabilistic forecast. We select different words to try to communicate what that one particular graphic is trying to convey. And we can do that in one-on-one conversations with our partners. We can do that in formal briefings, in Slack, in our chat means, so on and so forth. Many, many ways to slice and dice that up so that we communicate the right message and try to convey what that graphic is trying to depict for our partners. We can do this over the medium range and long range. These are these two graphics down here, where we're looking at a weekly probability of exceeding a particular flow threshold. And there's a way on our website where you can actually flip that around and look and say, what's the probability of being real low? Important for reservoir, for drawdown, right? For the water supply issues out west. I've been born and raised, done all my career here in the Northeast, so I'm very, very, what is behind me focused, flood focused out of necessity. But out west, it's the other side of the coin. Are we ever going? How much rain are we going to get in that? Is that going to make a dent in how I'm operating this reservoir because we've got downstream people that can't get water? We can do this over a weekly basis. We can do this over a 90-day period where we have these graphs that show the what we call the conditional simulation based on our current river model states of soil moisture, stream flow, etc. And what we do with these particular long-range graphics is the first 15 days is actually forced by the global ensemble forecast of temperature precipitation. And then we go from there and blend that over the next 5 to 10 days to a climatological average. And then we run the climatology out to 90 days, looking at how the river has behaved and how the temperatures and precipitation have behaved climatologically over the last 50 years or so, for example. And that's how we populate the last 65 to 70 days of this 90-day outlook. And all of these graphics are pretty uniform across the country. We convey this information through our websites. Our partners are familiar with it. The water supply folks are familiar with it. Some of our partners actually are able to come in and mine the raw data so they can actually see the spread for themselves, et cetera. But each one of these conveys something different. And that's why I start with, what are you focused on when you say communicating a hydrologic forecast? Because we could go in a lot of different directions. Is it the watch or warning message, right? Is it, hey, we have the potential for flooding. We have a watch out. What does that mean? That means pay attention. Maybe go through your call list if you're a town manager. Know who you're going to call. What are your local choke points? What roads might you close? Begin thinking this. If you're a homeowner, you've had flooding. Okay, you have a sump pump. Check the sump pump. Make sure the battery backup works. If your home's been flooded before, think about elevating stuff, right? It's that watch phase where we want people to take action. Or are we under a warning where here comes the flood wave and it's going to crest in a day, in 2 days, so on and so forth. Or by today's standards, are we trying to communicate the hydrologic forecast in a geospatial environment now by leveraging output from the National Water Model and leveraging our flood inundation services, which now, instead of trying to glean what's going on behind me from a hydrograph, whether it be deterministic or probabilistic, can we now actually begin to map what that might look like? And that's a game changer for us. So I just ask you to consider that as I begin to waltz through this in a little bit more detail. The significance behind what are we talking about when we say hydrologic forecast? Because the Weather Service, that takes many flavors, depending on where we are, depending on what the focus is, and depending on the community or partners that you're communicating with. So, you know, in general, if we look at the big picture of how the Weather Service does its business, right? We've got those good old text products, which by today's standards, you can rip them and read them, you know, on your favorite web page. In the case of Watches and Warnings, many times the TV stations will crawl that information at the bottom of your screen. But there's no extra interpretation provided with these. They are out there to stand alone in most cases. These types of products, Watches and Warnings, and to a degree, our river forecasts, when they reach certain thresholds, right? They can trigger alerts on your cell phone. In the case of warnings, they can light your cell phone off in the middle of the night. And we see this for a lot of our products and services. So it includes, you know, with respect to a hydrologic forecast, it includes these particular chef, what we call standard hydrologic format encoded forecasts, where we're able to disseminate to the technical users the actual time series data of the forecast precipitation of the forecast stream flow. Folks at Corps of Engineers suck that stuff up every day because that informs how they're going to operate their reservoirs over the next day, you know, or two or three. And in some cases, we can complement the text with a graphic, like if we're posting to social media, as an example. And of course, with our Watches and Warnings, again, these trigger all sorts of alerts and alarms and notifications. We have our graphical forecast, like we just saw, the kind of the McDonald's menu of stuff, depending on what you want to look at hydrologically. From short term, the next 5 to 10 days, to long range, where we're looking out 60 to 90 days. And as we go out in time, we're increasing the amount of information that we provide in a probabilistic framework by today's standards. But for us, what we try to do with our core partners, people like Corps of Engineers, people like emergency management, floodplain managers, from a hydrologic standpoint, water supply managers, what we typically do is we will conduct partner briefings. And what we're doing there is we're having our forecasters, meteorologists and hydrologists, walk that forecast the last mile to provide that extra level of context to what the information we're providing out there on our websites, in our text products and our graphics may really mean to them at the local level. And our agency has invested an immense amount of time, effort, energy, and training to get our forecasters to a point of doing this effectively. We've worked with social scientists like yourselves over the last decade to refine how we disseminate that information, whether it be the content in a graphic or it be the content in a briefing package, to hone in on that message. It's the old bluff principle, right? Basic line up front. You tell them once, you tell them a second time, and then you end it by telling them a third time. So that's where our investment has been in allowing and training our forecasters to truly do a better job of communicating the important information. The challenge we have is we don't often have an hour's time like we have today to talk about communicating during a flood event. In the cases of emergency managers, you'd be lucky to get 10 or 15 minutes. In the heat of battle, you'd be lucky to get a minute or two. And we just learned, we saw this lesson retaught to us in Texas during some flash flooding in October in a part of Texas where we had our flood inundation services live as part of our 10% rollout. That emergency manager was standing on a bridge in his town, and he was going choke point to choke point. And at every couple of stops, he'd call the River Forecast Center and he'd be talking to Derek Giardino on the phone, or he'd be talking to one of the forecasters at the San Antonio FO. And that forecaster would have 30 seconds to a minute with him to translate what he was seeing on his phone on our flood inundation map to what was happening in the field. And the discussion in a minute of when does this end? When does that water come down? When can I get assets in here to stop, repairing things? If the flood wave hasn't gotten downstream, how much longer before that water overtops that roadway? That's a line of questioning we've never, ever had to deal with before. But now we're beginning to pile the information on in the inundation mapping, for example, to begin to help answer that question. But when it comes down to communicating that hydrologic forecast, boy, time is of the essence. In our specificity, the conciseness, choosing the right words to emphasize the severity becomes a critical component. And that's something that that little dot on a hydrograph can't convey. It's something that we can't convey in impact statements during widespread floods. You just can't describe that in a product that's meaningful. It comes down to that personal communication, working one-on-one with that water manager. I chose the flood inundation example. You could very easily talk about New York City water supply and the reservoirs that they own and operate to supply the 9 million people in New York City with drinking water. They're very tuned into that short to medium range probabilistic forecast, because that means everything, their ability to keep clean water going in New York City. And in the case of Ashokan Reservoir, where they have an east basin and a west basin, making sure that they keep the dirty water out of the good water. And if they can't, then they have to treat that water, and then they have to pay penalties to EPA. It's a very different spectrum of problem, but they absolutely need our help in understanding what our probabilistic forecasts are saying. Again, coming down to our communication. So I'm just going to take a minute and step through, if it's all right with all of you, just to give you a little bit more of a sense of, some of the long-term, medium-range, short-term products. But consider this is kind of where we're headed now with our spring flood outlook, where we are providing a map like you see here off our new National Water Prediction Service, which is not, it's running in the public environment. It's still our test system. It will go live at the end of March. But here you're looking at, based on these nicely shaded squares of color, the likelihood that you're going to reach minor or moderate or even major flooding over the next 90 days, with a 25% or greater chance of exceeding that particular threshold. Where you have oranges, it means you get a 25% chance of exceeding minor. If you've got red, it means you've got a 25% chance of exceeding moderate. And God forbid, if you're magenta, you got a 25% chance of exceeding major. So this is one way of conveying in a spatial sense, where's the flood risk going into the spring right now. But then we can dig into this and go to a particular forecast point. And here we're looking at a location in Boonville, Missouri. And you'll notice in the weekly exceedance probabilities, what can we glean from this? Well, we can glean that there's a low probability that this location, sometime between February 3rd and March, the end of the week of March 16th, they've got a 10 to 25% probability of seeing at least minor flooding in any one of those weeks, or at least a river flow that would exceed that minor flood threshold. In this case, we're displaying it with respect to river stage because of the impact based on moderate, major, but we could also flip the axis and show that as flow for those who'd rather see the river flow that's resulting in this. But the probability, is much, much higher that based on the current state of affairs, when this model was run back on December 30th, that over the next 3 months, the really highest likelihood is that you're not going to get to minor flood in this area. Now, if we look at our 90-day exceedance probability, you can glean a little bit more information from it, because here we plot in blue our historical simulation. The historical simulation is based on historically where has this river been with respect to flooding this time of year over the next 90 days. And you can see that, for minor flooding, the historical representation would say that you've got about a 65% chance of seeing minor flooding there in any course of in the next 90 days. But our conditional simulation has lower probabilities. It's indicating conditionally, and what we mean by that is based on the model states, the state of the soil moisture, the atmospheric forcings from our weather models for the first 15 days, and then running climatology through it. Our likelihood of seeing minor flooding at this point, based on that forecast of December 30th, is showing a probability under 50%. What that means is that we're starting in a drier condition. The greater that separation, and the more that the blue is above the black, the drier your antecedent conditions are going into the next 90 days. So you can glean a little bit more information out of this. But you see, when it comes to getting into major or high and moderate and major flooding, the two lines kind of come together. Well, part of that is because there were very few times over the 50-year period that this location was calibrated that we actually got that high. So you have to factor all of these things in. But that's just one example for how we would communicate a message from this type of long-range predictive capability. Now, if we get within that 10-day period where we're talking medium-range outlooks, now we would leverage our new hydrologic ensemble forecast predictions. And in the eastern third of the country, we have an interface that we call basically the meteorology member ensemble. But what we've done is we've included our new hydrologic ensemble forecast services using the same types of graphical representation. But we can change it from the global forecast system to the North American model, rain and temperature solutions to the HEFS solutions. And what we see here in this particular river basin, which is down here in Carolina Eastman, down here in South Carolina, what we're seeing here is over the next 10 days in this particular forecast cycle, there must be a pretty good rain event coming, because we're seeing, a most likely of 25 to 75% likelihood of this river getting somewhere up into this blue area. Now, that's a pretty broad spread. And why might we have that spread? Well, I'd be looking at temperatures and precipitation. Here on the right-hand side is a breakdown of the accumulated precipitation. That's one of the key forcings for hydrology, right? How much rain is going to fall. And in this case, you have everything from very little rainfall to a forecast of over 5 inches. Now, we are 8 to 10 days out in the forecast realm. The ensemble mean, if you will, is showing maybe getting up over action. The median of precipitation over these 10 days is barely over a ½ inch. So we can have a conversation with the emergency manager saying, while there's some small potential here that we could get a pretty excessive rainfall event, the majority of the members that are forcing these hydrologic forecasts are suggesting this is more likely going to be a ½ inch to a 1 inch event. And that means we're likely going to be in the lower end of the threshold. We can look at each of the deterministic hydrographs from each of those ensemble members here on the lower left. And if it were a snowmelt event, I'd be focused on temperatures to know, are we accumulating snow or are we melting out snow? And what's the contribution of snowmelt to that total rise in the river? So a ton of information now that we can communicate with our partners. We can let the graphics stand alone. We can have our partners access the raw ensemble members if they so desire. But in most cases, when we talk about the emergency management community, it's this type of communication that we would have with them, trying to make sense of these ensemble predictions over the next 5 to 10 days to help kind of give them some goalposts of expectation of their real risk for minor or moderate or major flooding. And please don't hesitate to throw questions in the chat or raise your hand. Being a musician, I play clarinet, and I play a lot of Dixieland jazz. When you get on a roll, you get on a roll. So don't be afraid to interrupt me. So now let's come back to my hometown behind me, which has been living the dream with respect to our changing climate. We are in the urbanized I-95 corridor in central Rhode Island, where this river has its origins. We have a fresh water supply reservoir at the top of the basin that has said controls 65% of the water. It is a flood control reservoir. It has no flood protection capability. It was never designed for it. When they built this thing back in the late 19-teens, it was designed to be full in June going into farming season. What we're seeing now is because of our wetter climate, this reservoir is spilling on average before March 1st. So when we get to the true wet spring, this entire basin is on steroids. Now, what we witnessed this fall was we had moderate to major flooding, as you see here in December. We had a tremendously wet month of December. We had lost all the leaf cover, evapotranspiration shut down. Guess what that reservoir started doing the first week of December? Spilling. Had no capacity to hold. And as a result, with another big rainfall coming, we ended up with a major crest on this river. Now, we have pretty detailed impact statements here. So within a mile or two of that gauge, those impact statements, as you see in this case, get pretty detailed of what parts of town, what streets might be impacted. Not every one of our 3,600 forecast locations has that level of detail. In this case, it is detailed. Why? Because of the record flooding in March 2010. We were able to do a magnificent job of updating that level of detail. But you will not find an impact statement that describes this area behind me. Why? There's a dam downstream, and that stops the relationship of translating that river gauge 2 towns downstream to what the impact is up here. And that's why we were blind in 2010. We had my own observations from May rather, of 1982. And yes, we had a statement that documented some of that, but it was all downstream. So our impact statements and our ability to take that deterministic hydrograph and say something meaningful to an emergency manager, or in my case, a governor, is really limiting. And what we wished we had back then were those flood inundation services we're now providing today. Because there we have the capabilities of leveraging the national water model to bridge that gap. The river forecast center-based flood inundation, the flood inundation service coming off the actual crest forecast, will stop at that dam because you simply can't translate that any farther upstream. You're too far from the gauge, and now you have a fixed structure that's modifying the flow. But the national water model can do it. And that's why it's so complementary to what we can't show inundation-wise from this gauge downstream to where it enters Narragansett Bay. I wish to God we had this, but we didn't back then. So here are a couple of examples of the warnings, the text products that we will communicate. It could be an urban small stream-based thing where you're highlighting a portion of the state. Here, this one's saying Northern Rhode Island, including the counties of Kent and Providence. Well, right there, I got a problem, because as a born and raised Rhode Islander, I can tell you people don't know what county they live in. That's a communication problem. That's a challenge. In fact, they really don't even relate to the town they live in. It's most likely the village. That's the level of granularity that we as weather and water professionals have to be ready to communicate on, to talk to our locals. But in other parts of the country, it's different. In Texas, it's all county governance. New York, it's all county governance. State goes to the county, county works with the locals. But you got these home rule states like Rhode Island, where you've got villages within these towns. That's the level of granularity we often get asked about. In the middle example is a river flood warning, a flood warning for that very Patuxent River, commensurate with this particular crest. At 14.5 feet, what happens? So here are the homes, here are the streets you got to watch out for. But it's very limiting. It's not even mentioning, but a small section of West Warwick where there's really going to be inundation. So again, very limiting in what we can do. Powerful, tremendous information, but it's not giving that total operating picture. And that's why our flood inundation services become so important. Again, these are crawled on the TV stations. I've seen the TV stations put up the impact statements in the hydrographs. I pray to God that day comes where they're starting to show the inundation services so that they can actually show people, hey, if you're living in these neighborhoods, you got to pay attention. This prediction is saying you're going to be underwater. We're not ready to do depth. We can't tell them how deep. So in the case of West Warwick behind me, I would love to have been able to tell the governor, you're going to need a boat. And in Texas during Harvey, the governor needed helicopters. Just put it in perspective. But that's the kind of information the emergency managers want from us. And then to put this all together, come our ability to begin to provide that extra value through one-page outlooks in our formal briefing packages. These are 2 examples from some recent flooding. One from the River Forecast Center on January 8th, a couple of days in advance, where you see in that lower left-hand graphic, this shaded graphic indicating that there was a risk for significant flooding, as opposed to a significant flooding likely or significant flooding imminent or occurring. This was possible. We were 2 to 3 days out from the height of the second event on January 8th, considering that December 16th was kind of the first one. We had a respite, but we got the holidays off, as it were. Then we came back roaring with another big rain event. And you can see, the dot map indicating the current and forecast conditions, and just a couple of statements speaking about things like forecast confidence. That's something our partners always ask us for. And what do you see there called out? Very high level of confidence for where we're going to get the heaviest precipitation. This was going to be a Western New England event. But very low confidence for how much water is coming out of that snowpack. Why? Because of the uncertainty in the temperature forecasts. Do you glean any of that information from that slight risk map? No. Do you glean any of that information from the hydrograph? No. How do we convey that verbally? Having that one-on-one communication with the core partner to help them understand what are the contributors to what we're forecasting. What's our confidence? That is so often asked of us. Two questions. What's your confidence? What's the worst case scenario? Or what's your best guess? Or in some cases, if they really know us well, all right, I know that's what you're saying, but what do you really mean? That often comes to us too. We have to be a little careful how we answer on that. And then on the right-hand side is what the weather office was conveying to the partners. Here are your flood watches, moderate to high confidence in location of heavy rain. There's even a risk of severe thunderstorms, just add to the excitement. The timing of when that rain's going to arrive, timing when it may go off. And is there anything coming after this event, kind of that post-event outlook? And together, as river centers and as weather service regions and their weather offices, one of the things we've done well is we've come to these kind of standard templates of how we try to convey that additional information. So when we're briefing a partner and they're being served by multiple weather offices, like the state of North Carolina, for example, has 7 weather offices I think they have to deal with, 5 or 7 of them, they at least know that they're going to kind of see it the same way, present it the same way. And that's something that we've worked on as part of our evolution. But this is helping to walk that forecast the extra mile. And then the briefing package. When we get into the heat of battle, it's a big enough event. Now we're coordinating multiple times a day with a formal briefing deck, talking to the emergency managers and their constituents within each of the impacted communities. And these briefings, like I said, are done multiple times a day, depending on the magnitude of the event. And this is one example for Southern New England that was put together by the Boston Weather Office that I grabbed. Here, they start out, just to give you a feel of how these briefings go if you've never been on one. They had multiple hazards. I mean, it's sort of like, what the hell else aren't we forecasting? Good Lord. We got high winds, storm warnings in the marine. We've got coastal flood warnings, gale warnings, winter weather advisories, coastal flood advisories, wind advisories, flood watch. And we're making the gross assumption that we've trained all of these people well enough to understand the difference. And that's a communication problem. In some cases, they are well versed. But in some cases, especially the local emergency managers, where they're turning over, with every administration, many of these people are volunteers. They don't have the time to get into the details and the definitions of a lot of these things. So we have to be cautious about not taking a gross assumption of what the level of understanding is in the community we're speaking to. From here, we've gone to this type of framework of trying to highlight the major hazards. In this case, there are 4 of them: flooding and rainfall, coastal flooding, marine impacts, waves, wind, freezing spray on the water, etc. for mariners, and damaging winds. And then we try to describe the level of impact. We try to describe the location and give some sense of the timing in a table like this. And then, of course, in this case, they decided that that whole map of hazards needed a little bit more breaking down. And at this point, they would describe a little bit more what are the marine hazards we're focused in on, what's the timing of those hazards. Same thing with winds, same thing with the flooding. They'll present what the forcing is. Is it a big nor'easter? Is it a hurricane? In this case, it's just a big slug of water coming in with a big storm system. We expect areas of urban flooding, flash flooding, renewed rises where we've had flooding prior, heaviest rain overnight and early Saturday, but things will start to taper off Saturday morning. But the river rises will continue. Now we start pulling in some of the things I just showed you earlier, where we have our dot map. And in this case, there's my beloved Cranston, Rhode Island, right there, showing a 70% likelihood of moderate flooding. Up we go again. Okay. But you see how these services are incorporated into our briefings. And yes, if we need to, we can even pull in the probabilistic forecast to help show them our level of confidence. Here, we're not really worried about this river going to major. There's not going to be enough rainfall. But we're likely looking at a crest that's going to get up over 12 feet, up over moderate, and there's a high likelihood of that happening. That's the kind of discussion we'll have. And we're pretty confident the timing is going to be some time of this river cresting on the 14th. And we could even get more detail going back to that deterministic hydrograph, saying we're really confident we're probably going to see this thing peak out around lunchtime, early afternoon on the 14th. Another example here, here you've got the crest that's occurring now, and then another peak coming on the 13th, and then yet another rise on the 15th. So this is a unique example Where that flood on the 8th, now we're looking ahead, we're on the 12th. We're cresting, we're going to come back down, but we got 2 more rain events coming. So we can use these medium range forecasts out to 10 days to help convey that message that we may not be completely out of the woods with flooding after this next one goes by. And that's important information to convey. And then, of course, we wrap it up with, highlighting where you can get the information, how to contact us, the Twitter handle, Facebook. We've got, Slack. We're in Slack now with dedicated Slack rooms for our emergency managers, for the media partners, and for inter-office communication between field offices and so on. I want to be cognizant of time. So it's 2:41 my time. Steve, we can stop here for questions. The last couple of slides, we're just going to talk a little bit more about how much of a game changer the inundation services are, but this one picture might just satisfy that itch. So I want to make sure we have time for discussions. I've thrown a lot at everyone, I think, in just walking you through our business of how we do this, the services we provide from a forecast standpoint, and the types of ways we try to communicate the real meaning behind these products. So I'd be happy to just pause here. We can open it up for questions. Leave it up to you in the group.
David, if I had my way, I'd say can we get the best of both worlds, and you give us like a 2-minute overview of FIM and then open it up?
Sure, I can.
This big one.
I can, sure. So I'll aim for maybe 46 after the hour. So welcome back to my hometown of West Warwick. That 2010 flood took out 2 wastewater treatment facilities. It took out the shopping mall. It put ducks on the interstate. This is my picture from St. Joseph's Church, which is where that white car is, right there over my shoulder, right near those telephone poles. I was standing on the top steps at the church, about 20 feet above ground. And I shot that picture back toward where those firefighters were. This thing hit everybody. And now the missing link to me was that today we have inundation services that I could share with the state of Rhode Island to make them understand what might be happening and what might transpire over the next couple of days. So I bring it back full circle to my beloved hometown. So why are we doing the inundation services? It probably is intuitively obviously to you now, but this has come up years after years. We started developing these static libraries, but we've only got 200 of them. They're high resolution, hydraulic model based, but it takes time, money, and effort to develop those. And we did this through partnerships over the last 2 decades, but we've only got about 200 of these up online. We're doing this to help fill that service gap, to provide early warning to our partners, to provide actionable information to get them in a better position to prepare and respond to the flood threat. And we have selected this methodology called the height above nearest drainage to do that as an approximation method. But as we're learning, the more detail we can bring into it, the way we can incorporate HEC-RAS models, incorporate bridge deck data, we will improve the services as we go through our 4-year rollout. But the key feedback from our partners over the decades was that, while our warnings and our deterministic hydrographs were life-saving services, they lacked specificity of location, timing, and the detail of impacts. And this is what set us down this road following Hurricane Harvey to really accelerate the development. This is a heartbreaker to me. Not that 2010 wasn't big enough for my service area or my hometown. We got hit by Irene in 2011, which washed away the Schoharie Valley of southeast New York and the Catskill Mountains, parts of western New England, upstate New York, Vermont. Funny, a 100-year event ain't a 100-year event anymore because we exceeded some of these 100-year floods just this past summer in the state of Vermont. But this is from a town selectman in Rochester, Vermont. Now, we had the beginnings of these probabilistic hydrographs. You're seeing this one here from Center Rutland. In advance of Irene, where you could see we were struggling to capture the rapid rate of rise. Our model simply couldn't handle the volume of rainfall coming down in 6 to 9 hours. But this was very telling. We had warnings out. We had watches out for days. This thing had a name. People knew what was coming, but they didn't understand what would evolve. And we, quite frankly, weren't doing a good job of describing that. As the emergency manager said, we had no warning saying it would be so bad. Kind of gets to the question of define bad. I knew it was going to rain a lot, but I thought it was going to be the kind of rain that would test the patch I just put on my roof. I had no idea it would be the kind of rain that would wash away my neighbor's house. Oof. Let that sink in for a minute. What we do is life-changing. That's a powerful statement on as great as our forecasts were during that event, that lacking that level of detail. Susan, you have your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks, David. I was on the Hurricane Irene assessment team, so I just wanted to add a slight bit more context there. One of the things that was impeding, there were two things in my mind that were crucial to understand that were impeding people's ability to take in, right, the threat that Irene turned out to be. One was just that it was the kind of situation that is so rare, people don't have direct experience. And, there's a reason we have the word unimaginable, right, in English. Right? And that is very difficult to overcome in many ways. And the second thing I remember discussions on the team from the group that was up in New England talking about getting the attention of the powers that be, right, in the New England states and having a pretty good success rate, really, right? And I think it was Vermont where they got the governor actually out in front of a camera, saying, listen, it's coming. But of course, he was out in a beautiful, sunny, bright, lovely sort of day. And it didn't connect, like people had trouble connecting that image, that message with that context enough to take action. And I think that becomes a really complicating factor when we're talking about the communication dimension of helping people to really understand and take action on this kind of information. I'll shut up now.
No, that's a valid point. I think back to Hurricane Bob back in '91. It's a beautiful sunny summer afternoon on Sunday afternoon. And clear skies, for God's sakes, everybody at the beach. And we had a Cat 3 hurricane bearing down on us that would make landfall in Newport, Rhode Island 26 hours later. And how hard it was to get people to move. Well, that's great points. Thank you, Susan. So we've got our new dissemination services to be able to deliver this flood information now from our national viewer. We're going to be moving to our new national water prediction service to help bridge the gap and put this information together so that people now on their tablets, on their phone, on the web can actually see our official forecast and actually right beside it see where we're predicting inundation, be able to zoom in on this map and search around for their local neighborhood. Just doing a much more thorough job of putting this information in front of them. If they're looking at the National Water Model Inundation Services, they can also see what are the forecasts from the water model that are describing that flow that are resulting in that inundation. So that's where we're headed over the next several years of rolling out these flood inundation services. We've started with 10% of the nation, parts of Texas and parts of the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. We're going to expand that footprint now into the Midwest and head toward the Appalachians. We're going to include the Pacific Northwest by this September and Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, our first OCONUS region. And then at 60%, we keep expanding in both directions, east and west, finally reaching our last ports of call, which will be the East Coast from Florida to Maine and the Intermountainous West in the high terrain regions in the upper Midwest near the Canadian border. So, Steve, let's open it up for questions with the larger group here. And I see we have one question from Adam in the chat, actually two questions. First one, do we have a process to translate observed trends into actions needed to improve rebuild infrastructure? Honestly, we actually, from a trend standpoint, we rely on the USGS weather gauges from a riverine standpoint of looking for trends in the data, looking for changes in frequency of flooding per se. But we don't usually make those types of, suggestions for, improving, rebuilding the infrastructure. From a NOAA standpoint, we want to provide data to them and to help inform their decisions on what they may need to do. One of the big questions, of course, now is, does a 100-year floodplain mean anything anymore? But that's not our swim lane. That's FEMA's swim lane, owning and operating the National Flood Insurance Program, for example. So with stream gauges, do we need more? We need more observations of any type, quite frankly. The stream gauges give us ground truth. The stream gauges and the history of these gauges give us the ability to calibrate our models more effectively. Just like we use temperature and precipitation data to do that from our atmospheric modeling standpoint. Right now, we rely on flow because our models are calibrated to flow. We do operate the model on an hourly time step. So ideally, we'd like hourly time step data of any variety that we can incorporate into our data simulation. Right now, it's stream flow information, reservoir information. We've not done anything with remote sensing per se, and I know there are efforts out there to try to measure stream elevation, for example, from satellite. But we'd need that on a particular cadence to really be able to do an effective job of incorporating it into data assimilation, for example. But I think that's an area of research that's ripe for investigation, personally. Can you expand on the low confidence of snowmelt? Oh, yes. So one of the variables we look at when we're predicting a runoff event in the wintertime is what's our confidence in those temperature forecasts coming out of the numerical atmospheric models. And if they, are splitting the difference around that 32 to 34 degree temperature threshold, that means everything to that snowpack. And we have many cases in the wintertime where our models might be predicting, because the temperatures are warm, a liquefaction of a lot of that snowpack, and it doesn't happen because we ended up being colder. That's an example of how we try to, step into this gracefully on what's our confidence in that snowmelt contribution. If you're sitting right on the frontal boundary, your confidence is going to be low because you could go one way or the other. And sometimes it's still beyond the level of predictability, and we have to kind of couch it that way and give them more of the spectrum that if we end up on the warm side, you're going to end up in a moderate flood. If we end up with a cold rain and we don't really get that warming on the snowpack, we may just stay in that low and minor range. And that would be how we try to communicate that to our partners during an actual event. Susan, let's see. You've told us about a few communication challenges. Which one or ones do you see as most critical to address the immediate future? Ooh, I'm gonna have to think about that one for a minute. Because the dynamics are going to change to a degree as we get these inundation services out. That one I can't give you an immediate answer for. I'm going to have to put some thought to that. And let's see, Lisa, as you understand it, these visualizations are primarily used by meteorologists and machine managers to visualize forecast. There are circumstances where these kinds of maps would need to be interpreted by the general public. That's a great question. So much of our focus in the Weather Service has been toward the delivery of our impact-based decision support for the decision makers in the communities, not the general public. We put all of this information out there with various levels of training available to the public, either through information. There were some training courses out there if people wanted to take them. We try to provide some documentation as background to how to interpret the services. But when it comes to the general public, I would argue most people probably aren't seeing our information to begin with. That they're likely getting it from Facebook, Twitter, maybe from TV media, broadcast media. Many of them are trying to get it quickly, 30 seconds or less. And my experience is, unless they're living on a river that they're familiar with, if we put this in hydrologic context, they might not even realize there's a river gauge anywhere near them. And it comes down to local communication within the neighborhood, within the local communities, within the governance in that town, how that city or town, how they deal with these types of weather hazards. So I think as we've evolved, our efforts have been more toward those first responders and decision makers, more than trying to provide a briefing for the public to interpret, for example. Because we have found that so many people now, in this digital age, are getting their information not from our website or from NOAA Weather Radio, which have been our bread and butter. They are getting it through other means, in many cases, private sector means, where that information is packaged for them in some way, in a tweet, in a scroll, in a text message, and a notification on their phone. That's an interesting question. And I would argue, even with our flood inundation services, we've really set the bar pretty high. I mean, we're going into this with a high bar. I made the sort of tongue-in-cheek point about Rhode Island. We issue warnings by county in some cases, but people don't know what county they're in. They know the village that they're in within their town. Can they find their place on a map? We really take that for granted. We're assuming they do, but I would argue that in some cases, that's not at all the case. And these services are probably going to be less useful to them. But we hope that we have the lines of communication within the community, that the information in some way, shape, or form is provided to them with enough lead time to allow them to make those important decisions to protect their life and protect their property. Great questions. The Winter Storm Severity Index. I'm going to argue, Zach, all floods are local, just like politics. Because one block away, they're high enough where not a damn thing happened. And I could argue their basement probably didn't even flood. But if you were living in that right zone along that river channel, you were toast. So I think it would be very difficult to kind of put a severity index on a flood. But just because of its spatial variability, the nature of the event, the antecedent conditions, the potential for debris blocking underneath bridges, it is so many facets to it, so many dimensions to a hydrologic flood threat. And I think it would be, and that's probably why we haven't done it yet. It's really, really complicated to try to throw a simple index. Look what's happened with the Saffir-Simpson scale for hurricanes. That's still going the way of the dodo. Why? Because it was ineffective. As we learned more, we had more events, we realized people weren't heeding the message. It wasn't quite resonating with them. We have developed now more hazard-specific information, like the storm surge warning. Hey, you're going to have water that's 6 feet deep in your neighborhood. Get out. You know your zone. We're not there hydrologically. People don't know this zone because there are no zones unless you're paying the flood insurance. Then you only know 2 zones: 100-year or not 100-year. But am I paying? Am I not paying? It's real true. We have a different context over decades of experience with hurricane evacuations. We simply don't have that construct in the communities in the riverine communities, and that's a challenge for us. All right, great question.
Hi, Mark.
Thank you.
Hi, Ross. How are you?
I want to check
Good,
in.
how are you doing?
I'm fine. Can you see me?
I think David, you've got somewhere else you need to be now, right?
Yes, I do at 3, actually. I do, unfortunately.
Thank you again for talking to us. Thank you again to everybody for joining. And we will see you again in a few weeks. Might be the first week of March, not February, for the next webinar.
And Zach, if people have more questions, feel free to reach out to me with them. I'd be happy to answer them.
Sounds good. And hopefully we'll see a lot of you at AMS next week.
Yes,
we'll
absolutely.
so.
Excellent. I'll be stopping in for sure. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank everyone. Bye-bye.